Okay, so these past couple months, I spent a great deal of my time researching the history of abortion. And after researching the subject throughout classical literature, I grew interested in the comparison of literature about abortion from ancient times to contemporary times. And my goal was to show that many of the dynamics in the conversation about abortion that existed thousands of years ago still exist today. And we like to believe that the conversation has evolved due to the increase of scientific knowledge on the subject. But there are many factors that actually remain the same. And to prove this, I decided to focus on literary works from the classical era, so ancient Rome, ancient Greece, and see how they compare to some of the legislative acts on abortion that are going through Congress right now. So, some historical context. There was no law restricting abortion in ancient Rome or ancient Greece, and the majority of people debating abortion were male scholars, so philosophers, poets, writers. And then in the United States today, abortion is deemed a fundamental right by Roe v. Wade. However, there are many bills passed in Congress in an attempt to restrict abortion, and an estimated 75% of these bills are voted on and put forth by only men. And similar to current times, abortion was only allowed in certain situations in ancient Rome and ancient Greece, even though it was legal. And the same circumstances and facts that are in place in both the classical era and the contemporary era exist, like the majority of people speaking on the subject are males. And these factors have kind of an effect on the legality of abortion, and they create the same outcome for both time periods. And many of the arguments that exist about abortion today are traced back to the classical era. So I analyzed the literary works of many classical scholars like Hippocrates, Aristotle, Plato, Cicero, all speaking about abortion, and they all presented various arguments against the act. But Ovid, who is a Roman poet famous for Metamorphoses, actually wrote two poems specifically about abortion in Amores, which is a book of love poems. And I chose these two poems to present today because out of all the other classical literature I wrote about, I think Ovid managed to capture a lot of arguments against abortion that can be compared to current arguments. And these two poems kind of best exemplify the views of the Greeks and Romans on abortion. And as part of my project, I'm translating these two poems from Latin to English because I think a lot of Ovid's original meaning can be lost when it's translated. And the first poem is titled The Abortion, and the second one is titled Against Abortion. And they follow the narrator, who is a man who just found out that his girlfriend, Karina, performed an abortion on herself. So it opens with the line, Karina lies there, exhausted, in danger of her life, after rashly destroying the burden of an unborn child. And what's interesting about this line is that it's one of the only lines where Karina is mentioned. The narrator goes on to say something like, she destroyed this child, I'm not even sure if it's mine, I don't really know. And it's interesting because the focus just automatically shifts to the narrator. And Karina is described as being in this very dire situation, and the poem just automatically shifts. And you would think that with a poem titled The Abortion, she would be mentioned more often. And the rest of the poem is essentially about the father running to the temples to pray. And this kind of shows the lack of the focus on the mother, even though it seems as though she would be at the center of attention. And this focus on the father shows up throughout ancient Rome and ancient Greece. Many male scholars believe that abortion took away the father's rights to be called a father, or the father's right to an heir. And there was a case in ancient Greece where a man sued his wife for homicide after she had an abortion, and his argument was that she had denied him the right to be called a father and the right to an heir, so she deprived him of a son, basically. And Cicero in ancient Rome cited a case where a woman accepted a bribe from family members to have an abortion, and the people who bribed her were the alternate heirs to the father's wealth, and they didn't want to share their fortune. So basically, in a lot of situations, the father was kind of made out to be the victim. And the ideas on abortion and the motives behind abortion kind of revolved around the father in the classical era. And then currently today, there's still this focus on the father. For example, in Missouri, there's a bill called House Bill 131, which requires a woman to have the written consent of the father before an abortion. If the father's deceased, she must provide the right paperwork to prove it, and then if the father cannot be identified, the woman cannot obtain an abortion. And this bill just kind of shows how there still remains this focus on the father. So in his second poem titled Against Abortion, Ovid writes, "What incites you to pierce your troubled body with your hand? No tiger in its Armenian lair would do it. No lioness would dare destroy her fetus." And Ovid is essentially arguing that abortion is unnatural and it goes against what is meant to be. And this argument still exists today, and it takes the form of certain types of restriction bills on abortion. In Georgia, there's a bill called the H.R. 954, which would require women to carry all pregnancies to term, including for cases of rape and incest. But this particular bill is unique because it doesn't allow abortion even if the fetus is already dead and has no viability for life. So at the basis of this bill is the argument that abortion is unnatural. Even if the fetus is dead, a woman must carry to term. And then in Tennessee, there's a House bill called 3517, which would allow homicide and assault charges to be filed in cases of miscarriage. So not only are there laws that argue that abortion is unnatural, there are laws that argue that all terminations of pregnancy, including naturally occurring ones, are considered unnatural. So another argument that Ovid makes in his poem is that a woman must make the sacrifice of carrying her child for the greater good. He writes, "If Ilia had murdered the twins in her swollen womb, the founders of my mistress's city would have been lost. If Venus had desecrated her belly, pregnant with Aeneas, earth would have been bereft of future Caesars." And this line shows how this specific argument is really age-old. This argument shows up in the form of personhood amendments today. For example, in Louisiana, there's a House Bill 587, which was presented as a direct challenge to Roe v. Wade, and it restricts all abortions unless it was medically necessary for the health of the fetus. So for cases of rape, incest, or the health of the mother, no exceptions would be made. And then in Pennsylvania, there's a bill titled the H.R. 358, and that would allow hospitals to deny abortions even if failure to provide an abortion would result in the death of the mother. So it's basically the argument that you should put the health of the fetus over the health of the mother. So when wondering about the reason behind Corina's abortion, the narrator asks, "No doubt you chance your arm in that dismal arena just to keep your belly free of wrinkles with your crime." And this was a common view during the classical era. Many scholars believe that women only had abortions out of vanity, and it also shows how distanced men were from the situation. They only had the outsider's perspective, which led to a lot of inaccurate information about the reason that women had abortions and information about the procedure itself. For example, Hippocrates, who's a very well-known physician, believed that jumping up and down would be enough to cause an abortion by causing the embryo to fall out. And this was a very popular method during that times. It was actually coined the Lacedaemonian leap because women were doing it all the time trying to induce an abortion. And it was rumored that just walking energetically would be enough to induce an abortion, which is not true. And in recent times, there are bills passed in some states where abortion is only allowed in cases of rape. Even then, adequate evidence has to be provided for the case to be qualified as rape. And this is all to ensure that women are receiving abortions for what is considered the right reason. So there's still this notion that women are having abortions for the wrong reasons, for self-serving reasons. And it also kind of depicts abortion as a luxury or a not medically necessary procedure. And then in Indiana, there's a House Bill 1210, which requires all women to be informed of an increased risk of breast cancer from abortion before the procedure takes place, even though there's no scientific data to back this up. Similarly, in House Bill 166 in South Dakota, doctors are required to tell women seeking abortions that they face an increased risk of suicide ideations, which is also not backed up by any medical evidence. And this shows how there's still a circulation of inaccurate information on abortion, even though science has evolved and we know better. So Ovid writes, "Often she who kills her child dies herself. She dies and is carried to the pyre with loosened hair, and whoever looks on cries out, 'She deserved it.'" And Ovid is highlighting the shame that is brought on by others that women often feel after an abortion. And there's still some power in causing women to feel threatened through shaming. There's a bill in Tennessee, which is the House Bill 3808, which, if passed, would provide the names of the doctors who perform abortions and the women who have abortions by posting them on the internet. And this information will reveal a woman's name, age, county, race, marital status, education level, number of children, location of procedure, and how many times she has been pregnant. And the aim of this bill is to make women think twice about having an abortion by causing them to feel threatened. So the narrator of the poem, while upset with Karina over her abortion, says, "Whoever first taught the destruction of a tender fetus deserved to die by her own warlike methods." And this is kind of a very strong opinion to have on the matter, but many people have taken Ovid's argument to heart, and abortion clinics and abortion doctors have come under attack. And similar to ancient Rome and ancient Greece, the right to an abortion, which is considered legal, has become more restricted. There's an estimated 1,000 bills that have passed through Congress restricting access to abortions and essentially increasing the criminalization of it. And these legislative acts include, but are not limited to, mandatory ultrasounds, mandatory waiting periods, cuts in federal funding, and requiring a woman to hear the fetal heartbeat before the procedure. In fact, the fetal heartbeat bill states that if a woman does not wish to see or hear the fetal heartbeat, she may close her eyes and put her hands to her ears, which is a strange alternative. But many of the same factors on the debate on abortion exist in both ancient times and modern times. So that means the same results exist too. The same people are at the front of the discussion. The same arguments are being made. The same type of inaccurate information is being spread. And this means that there are similar outcomes. For example, the issue still remains shrouded in secrecy, and women in desperate situations are often left to take matters into their own hands. This means they often take drastic measures and have to become very resourceful in procuring an abortion because they're forced to do it in private. So basically my argument was that women are kind of left in the same situation that they were in thousands of years ago. Yeah, that's it. Izzy?
You talked about how Ovid's, in his first poem, the narrative shifts immediately from mentioning Karina to just talking about father, and he's like, "Oh, like, I'm never going to give you a dad, like, what the heck?"
Mm-hmm.
Do you think that things would be different nowadays, especially if instead of thinking about kind of like the male perspective or like even the fetus, people just thought like about the health of a woman? Because then you also mentioned kind of back alley abortions and stuff like that.
Yeah. Yeah, I definitely think there needs to be more of a focus on the women because a lot of what happens is shrouded in secrecy, and women often have to find their own ways to have an abortion. There's actually, I talked to Planned Parenthood about this, and there are cases where people will call up Planned Parenthood, and when they find out about all these restrictions that their state have, like for example, like mandatory waiting periods, and they realize they can't actually have a safe abortion. One girl said, what if I just tell you the items in my kitchen and you tell me what to do? So, yeah. Maggie?
So you were doing, but you were like reading a lot of like really old like classic stuff. Like, so I bet that like this was probably a hard time. But did you like come across any writing about abortion that was written by women, or was it just like men putting their like just talking about other women and then about their experience with other women having abortions?
It was only men. I couldn't find a single source that was from a woman, but there are sources where there's a guy in ancient Greece called Pliny the Elder who was watching this ceremony that was taking place of these women who were basically worshiping a tree, and he didn't know the meaning behind it, so he just made up his own meaning. He said it was like a tree that promoted like chastity or something, but it turned out that this tree was actually able to induce abortions, and he just didn't know that, and it was like very clear that he didn't know that, and it was, yeah. Yeah.
Did you look at Sappho at all?
Yeah, I did. I didn't see anything explicitly stated about abortion, but I definitely looked into her works, yeah. Is he?
How often, you mentioned a lot of House bills, how many of them like actually get passed and stuff? because a lot of them seem to be going directly against Roe v. Wade, like the one that's prevented any type of abortion at all ever.
Yeah.
How do these come to, like, how often do they actually become ratified and stuff?
I think about half of these bills that I mentioned are already in place, and a lot of these are still being met. I looked on state websites and all that, and I could find out when these bills were being when these meetings were taking place and like the makeup of the committee and stuff. But a lot of these bills have already passed. Yeah.